Hello everybody, Larry Young here again with another segment of OLaMan Living Life with Purity. And today I want to take a moment to reflect on something I used to always tell my young ball players that would come to me, and I'd have an opportunity to talk with them about formation and how to go from being young men to adult men, and how to take charge of things in their lives, and how to forgive things that they may have done or may have happened to them in their past that might be holding them back as they try to move forward with their new goals and objectives, their telos, their objective that's far away that they see themselves being at someday. So, and one of those things is that every second of every day is an opportunity to change and to pivot. If something went wrong, you made a mistake, you accept that mistake, you admit that mistake, and then you move forward. But you might have to pivot into a more open direction, that being the path towards your telos. So with that, though, is basically God's grace and redemption that comes in those moments. And a lot of you know I have a mother who's 98 years old. A lot of people call her Saint Rita, and probably for good reason, because she raised me and two other sons and two other daughters. But I think I was probably the bigger problem in her life, even though my oldest brother suffered with diabetes most of his life, and she had to deal with that too. But I think I was probably the bigger complicating factor, and the people who know me and know the story have given her the title of Saint Rita, jokingly, but I think there's some merit in that. But aside from that, I was talking with my mother, and I asked her, I said, while she was watching one of the segments, I said, is there something you think I should talk about that you want me to cover? And she said, yes. She says, I want you to tell the story about the boy in the hospital. And I knew what she was talking about, and I had to refresh it a little bit. But my mother was a nurse back immediately after World War II. She'd gone into nurses training during the end of the war, and as the war subsided, she was there to help take care of a lot of these returning veterans and people who were scarred in the war, damaged, and she worked at the VA hospital. And she was telling me this story about this young man that was there that was opposed to having any kind of religious people in his room. He was not doing very, very well, and his mother was there, and she was trying to get the young man to have a priest come in, somebody to come and to bless him and take care of him, because the young boy was dying. But my mother wasn't quite aware of that. She was just the attending nurse, but she didn't know all the details about what was going on in this kid's life. But leading up to that, there was another story I want to get to first. That's when my older brother, Peanut, was in the hospital. He was 9 years my senior, and it was 20 years ago this year that he passed away in the hospital with diabetes, or from complications from diabetes. Nobody dies from diabetes. They die from 16 other things that add up. And my brother was going through his end-of-life phase, and his wife was a Protestant woman, a very good woman, but she wasn't a Catholic, and my brother and I were raised Catholic. But as my brother had entered into his life with his wife, he adopted more of her patterns and her church philosophy going forward. And it was good, but it was not detailing the Eucharist in their communion. So it was a non-Catholic church that he was attending with her. And so in his final days, he was resistant to having the priest come in, the Catholic priest come in to bless him or to offer him communion. For one thing, he was so weak that it was hard for him to even swallow. And that became a real problem for him towards the end as well. But that being what it was, when I knew that it was his final day or days coming up, I implored him to please. I said, we always talked in baseball terms and metaphors with each other, that he would be chemically or drug-induced into a coma for periods of time. Sometimes it'd be for the day, sometimes it'd be for several days. And when he would wake up, I'd be there, and he'd say, who's got the ball? And that was our metaphor of who's still on the mound pitching. And I told him, said, you've got the ball, you're still on the mound. You've got the call over what goes on with you. I'm not making any calls for you at this point. Your wife is not making the calls at this point. You're still in charge. Your wishes are still intact. And so that was always great comfort to him, that when he was out and not aware of what was going on in his coma situation, that when he would wake up, that would always be one of the first things he'd ask me is, who's got the ball? And I'd say, you got the ball. You're still pitching. Let's go. And with that, he'd have a great comfort. When it got down to his last 36 hours, and he knew that the time was coming, and he was able to set the terms of his own passing, to disconnect from the machines. Everything had been done. We were doing superhuman efforts to just, mechanically keep him alive. And when he finally came to his resolution that he had done everything he possibly could, he looked at me and he says, I'm giving you the ball. And I took it. But then I still talked with him. I said, so how do you want to handle these next few hitters? And he said, let's try not to walk them. And so I said, okay. And with that, then I said, let's go for a strikeout. And he says, okay. He says, how are we going to do that? I said, I'd like you to receive communion and have your confession heard. And he didn't like that so much. He was still trying to be in control of things. And this is what happens a lot of times when people are in their end moments, is they're still trying to have some control over their life and their choices. And they want those choices to be honored because it matters. It matters to them. And so, reluctantly, he did agree for me to bring in a priest to hear his confession and to give him a bit of the host that he was able to put on his tongue and still be able to swallow. He wanted to do this without, his wife knowing or his kids knowing. He wanted to make sure that this was a private moment for him. It wasn't going to be a point of concern or a feeling that he was rejecting their faith and belief in the church that they were going to. So he was still trying to take care of his family in that moment. But I asked him to please take care of himself because it mattered so much. So he did receive the sacraments, and a sense of peace and fulfillment came upon him in his last 24 hours or so. And he did pass away on time, and the family was all there, and it was a nice, peaceful passing, but you could feel this grace that was in the room at that moment. Incredible. Well, my mother was telling me a story about when she was a young nurse, and she was a night nurse, and so it's very lonely on the night shift, taking care of these patients that you have on your roster, and with not a whole lot of extra help around. So she liked the night shift, though, because it was less complicated, I think, than the day shift activities were. And she was able to practice her craft as a nurse, I think, much better that way. And she had this young man who was obstinate about not having any church people. He was definite in his opinion that no priests or pastors or anyone coming in to talk about Jesus was not to be let into his room. Well, my mother, St. Rita, kind of heard that, but also then had her own mission statement going on in her life that, she was not only there to take care of the body, but her training and her naturalness about her was to identify the soul and its needs as well. And so this young man was had his mother and his brother were there visiting, and my mother got off at 7 o'clock at night was the end of her shift. Or 7 o'clock in the morning was the end of her shift. And this morning the mother was there, the brother was there, and there was a priest coming down the hallway. And my mother flagged down the priest who was making his rounds, and he'd been told not to go into this room. And my mother she said, "I think you're needed in here." And the priest just, looked at her like, "Are you crazy?" She said, "I think you're needed in here." So she directed him into the room, and the priest identified himself, and the young man threw a conniption fit, was really upset about the whole thing, and wanted this motherfucker out of there, get him out of here, I don't want him in here, get this guy out of here. The words he was using and the anger that was being expressed was pure reaction and anger in that moment. And the young man was angry, and probably rightfully so, about his, death coming. And he was angry that he was going to have to die. And I don't think my mom actually knew that the kid was that close to dying. And she knew his situation was complicated and bad, but she didn't know how critical it was. Well, anyway, she got this priest in there. The young man resented. His mother, at the foot of the bed, implored the young man to please, please, please listen and at least, tell this priest what's on your mind and at least do something, please. The mother is asking. The body is basically dying on this young man. The mother was concerned about the sovereignty and the safety of this man's soul, her son. So my mother stayed out of it. The priest was being rejected, and the one thing that my mother can't understand is why on earth the priest stayed there in the midst of all this vial being thrown at him. And I told her, I said, well, it probably wasn't his first rodeo. He'd probably seen this many times before with younger people especially, or anyone in particular who was angry about them being called away from this life and not having the actual confidence in a forthcoming life afterward. So the young man, without more prompting from anyone, decided, he says, okay, do what you're going to do. He says, okay, I'll do it. And with that, the mother and the brother both left the room, and it was just the priest and this young man in the room. The priest heard the young man's confession and administered him communion. And everyone went back in, and the feeling in the room, there was a little bit of coldness there, but it was warming up. It was warming up for everyone. There was a sense of hope. There was a sense of thankfulness. There was this grace had come down upon everyone in that room. And with that, it was time for my mother to sign off on her shift and turn everything over to the next crew coming in. So she did that. She went home, and unbeknownst to her, she didn't know what had happened, but the young man died. And so my mother came in for her shift that evening. She was putting her keys up on a rack in a check-in room, so she didn't have to carry her house keys and stuff like that around with her. But as she was doing that, the administrator for all the nurses pulled her aside and said, hey, Brownie. They called her Brownie. And said, that young man that you were working with there, he died this morning. And she had kind of a shocked look on her face. He died at 8 a.m., 1 hour after she clocked off. And the young man had passed away, but he had passed away in grace. He passed away within an hour of having received absolution for his sins and receiving Holy Communion. Now, if it hadn't been for my mother sort of disobeying what the floor orders were and what this young man's preconceived and continually expressed wishes to not have anything like that going on, she did not listen to that part of it because that was not the good. That was not what her own divine indwelling was calling for her to do. And so, against the wishes of the young man, she offered the priest in, and eventually this young man did make a decision to accept it. And I think with that, then his anger about a situation and his resentment of everything was gone. And so in that last hour of his life with his family, he was able to have a good and open, loving atmosphere. And he was able to die in love and peace, and not in anger and fear. So, this is how God's grace works. And my mother was asking, she says, why did that happen? I said, well, you were just acting on what was natural to you. And this is where the divine indwelling of the Holy Trinity, if you can think about these things, this is what you develop, this divine indwelling. This is a call to purity. This is what Our Lady's asking for. She's asking not for so much our physical, but our spiritual commitment. And this is what happened in these final moments with this young man. It was due to my mother's natural inclination to save the soul along with the body that this young man was delivered in there. So much like how St. Augustine was in his final hour, that he was converted and accepted Jesus, and this young man was back in good graces to die that way. So what a lucky, fortunate situation for this guy. So keep in mind, every second of every day is an opportunity to change. It is an opportunity to choose that which is what you're called to do. You can reject it all you want from before, but as long as you're willing to accept it in a state of acceptance and grace, God is there and Jesus is there to take you home. So this is what our call to purity is. This is what our feather strokes are. This is where you do things, the hard things, but when you end up doing it so often, it becomes natural to you. It becomes the divine indwelling. And you don't have to question these things so much as you go through it, because it's a natural response to God and your nature. So, cool stuff all the way around. I'm not saying everyone needs to go out there and find somebody who's dying and bring them to our Lord at the end, but you can do this with your feather strokes and your fine example throughout the day. You don't have to use words to preach the gospel. Use your words. This is your purposeful intent. Bring it all together. So, this one's for St. Rita. And great, powerful stories that are timeless and they continue on. And no matter what your family name is or where things are going on like this, it's always available. And anytime you can get somebody to come to terms with these things, drop the anger, and pick up the happiness and joy that comes with the knowing of God is there for you, and Jesus has suffered for you so you don't have to. becomes very, very powerful. So, I love you, and I'll be back.